It was just another ordinary evening, the sun dipping low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the small, quiet town. But for one mother, this evening would turn into a nightmare. Her young daughter, no more than 10 years old, had been playing outside when she suddenly vanished. Panic spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. A frantic search began, but the hours ticked by, and there was no sign of the little girl. As darkness fell, the feeling of helplessness weighed heavy. How could she have just disappeared? Days passed, but still no trace of the girl. The mother, desperate and tearful, appealed to the community for help. Flyers were posted, social media was flooded with photos of her child, and every lead seemed to fade into nothing. It was the worst kind of waiting, heart-wrenching, unbearable. As the days stretched into an agonizing week, the authorities were starting to lose hope, but the mother never gave up. She knew, deep down, that her daughter was out there somewhere. Then, just when the town was starting to accept the unthinkable, something unexpected happened. The phone rang late one afternoon. On the other end, a voice, calm but firm, said something that no one could have anticipated. "We have your daughter. We're bringing her home." The line went silent for a moment. The mother could hardly believe it. Was this a prank? But the voice on the other end was serious. The words were clear. The girl was coming home, but there was something strange about the way the caller spoke. The doorbell rang a few hours later, and when the mother opened the door, she was met by a group of strangers. They were black, a family that the mother had never seen before. Holding her daughter in their arms, they gently set the child down on the porch, then turned to leave without a word. It all happened so fast, and the mother was left standing there, stunned, unsure of what just transpired. How did they find her daughter? What had happened during the days she was missing? The girl was safe, but her eyes told a story that left her mother shaken. She had been through something that was clearly too much to put into words. She was back, but the questions were only just beginning to pile up. Why had these strangers found her when no one else could? Why had they kept her for so long? And what had they been through in those days apart? The story took an even stranger turn as the mother tried to piece together the details. The girl spoke little, but when she did, her words raised more questions than answers. She mentioned strange places, people she couldn't fully explain, and events that seemed so far out of reach that they couldn't possibly be real. And yet the mother couldn't help but wonder, could there be something more to this than just a simple abduction? Or had the strangers, the neighbors, been keeping a secret all along? As the mother tried to make sense of it all, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that the girl's return was only the beginning of something much bigger, something that would change everything they knew about their small town, their neighbors, and perhaps even the very people who had brought her home. There were hints of something darker lurking beneath the surface, something the family might not fully understand yet, but one thing was clear: nothing in their lives would ever be the same again. The story is far from over, and the journey the mother and daughter are about to embark on will lead them into uncharted territory. What really happened during those missing days? Why did those strangers bring her back? And what is the truth behind the mystery of their quiet neighborhood? Stay tuned, because in the next part of this story, we'll uncover the hidden truths that no one saw coming. The answers are just out of reach, until now. Keep watching to find out what happens next. The days after the girl's return were filled with questions. The mother, still in a daze from the shock of the unexpected reunion, tried to make sense of everything. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized she didn't have any answers. Who were these strangers, these people who had brought her daughter home, and why had they done so? She had lived in this town for years, yet she'd never seen them before. They didn't look like the type of family who would be in the area. They had an aura about them that was hard to place, as if they belonged to another world entirely. The girl, however, was the one who had the most troubling silence. She hadn't spoken much since the day she was returned, only muttering a few words here and there, her voice low and distant. It wasn't the same girl the mother had known before. She seemed different now, older, more guarded, her eyes filled with an unsettling mixture of fear and confusion. The way she avoided her mother's gaze left a painful knot in the woman's chest. She knew her daughter was holding something back. But what? The mother spent hours talking to her daughter, trying to coax any details from her. But the girl remained tight-lipped, her responses short, her voice tinged with uncertainty. She couldn't even explain where she had been or who had taken her. All she said was that she had been somewhere far away, a place that felt nothing like home, a place that felt wrong. The girl kept repeating the words, "I didn't want to go there." It was hard for the mother to understand. How could this be happening? How could her daughter, who had always been so full of life and curiosity, suddenly become so withdrawn? There was a part of her that wanted to blame herself for not keeping a closer eye on her, for letting her slip away without realizing something was wrong. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was more complicated than that. As the days passed, the questions only multiplied. Why had the strangers brought her daughter back home? And why didn't they say anything? They had left without a word, and the mother was left standing in the doorway, feeling more confused than ever. She tried to track them down, but no one in the town seemed to know who they were. They had disappeared as suddenly as they had appeared. In the midst of her worry, the mother began to notice strange things happening around their house. At night, she could hear whispers outside her window, soft voices that seemed to be carried on the wind. It wasn't a regular occurrence, but every now and then, she'd hear something, almost like a conversation. But when she looked out, there was no one there. The hair on the back of her neck would stand up, and a feeling of unease would wash over her. What was going on? Was it just her imagination, or was something more sinister at play? The girl, meanwhile, seemed to be slipping further into herself. She would often wander around the house, staring at the walls, as if seeing something the mother couldn't. She would murmur things under her breath that made no sense, words that sounded like they were from a different language. The mother had never heard her daughter speak like this before. Was it possible that she had been changed somehow during her disappearance? Or had she been exposed to something that no child should ever have to experience? Despite all the confusion, there was one thing that the mother was sure of. She needed answers. She couldn't rest until she understood what had happened to her daughter and who the people were that had brought her back. So she decided to investigate further. She started by asking around the neighborhood, hoping someone might have seen something unusual. But every inquiry led to a dead end. The townspeople seemed to have no answers, and many of them didn't even seem to recognize the family that had returned her daughter. It wasn't until she decided to visit the local library that things began to take a strange turn. The librarian, a quiet woman with sharp eyes, had always been someone the mother trusted. After she explained what had happened, the librarian's face grew pale. She looked around as if to make sure no one was listening before she leaned in closer. "I don't know how to say this," the librarian said, her voice trembling. "But I've heard stories about families like that, about people who come from nowhere and go nowhere, people who take children." The mother's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, not sure if she wanted to hear the answer. The librarian hesitated, glancing over her shoulder before speaking again. "There are rumors. They'd been around for years, though most people have forgotten about them. But some say there's a group, a family, or maybe more than one, who take children, only to return them later, changed. They don't explain what happens. They just leave. And sometimes the children are different when they come back." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and chilling. The mother's mind raced, the puzzle pieces clicking into place. Could it be possible? Could her daughter have been part of something much bigger than she could ever have imagined? The librarian's warning stayed with her as she left the library, the unsettling weight of the unknown pressing in on her. She couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something was wrong, something that was out of her control. She had to find out the truth, even if it meant risking everything. That night, as the mother sat by the window, her thoughts consumed by the strange family and the odd stories, she heard it again. The whispers outside her window, more distinct this time, as if they were just beyond the glass. She pressed her ear to the cold window pane, straining to hear. The voices seemed to be calling her name, soft but insistent. Was it the wind? Or was someone out there, watching her? The tension in the air was thick, and as she turned to check on her daughter, she found her standing in the hallway, her eyes wide with fear. The girl's lips trembled, but no words came out. It was then that the mother knew. The mystery wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Something was coming. Something neither of them could escape. The following days felt like a blur to the mother. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, her mind racing with questions. The whispers outside her window grew louder, almost impossible to ignore. She would lie in bed, wide awake, heart pounding, waiting for the soft murmur of voices to fade. But they never did. They lingered, like a dark presence that refused to go away. She couldn't tell if she was hearing things, or if someone was truly out there, but the unsettling feeling gnawed at her constantly. Her daughter had grown increasingly distant. She barely spoke, only nodded or shook her head when asked a question. The girl would often stand by the window, staring out at the street for hours, her expression unreadable. At times, she seemed to be lost in thought, almost as if she were trying to remember something that didn't belong to her. And when she did speak, it was in hushed tones, her words barely above a whisper. "I'm not supposed to be here," she would mutter to herself, a faraway look in her eyes. "They're coming back for me." The mother had tried to comfort her, but it was clear that the girl wasn't the same. Something had changed in her. It wasn't just the strange behavior. There was a coldness about her now, a sense of detachment. The bond they once shared, so strong and comforting, had fractured. It was as if her daughter was no longer the little girl she had raised, and the thought of it twisted the mother's heart. As the tension in their home grew, so did the strangeness outside. The mother began to notice things that made her blood run cold. Neighbors she'd known for years acted strangely around her. They would look at her and then quickly look away, as if they knew something she didn't. The few people she tried to speak with about the disappearance of her daughter seemed to avoid the topic altogether, shifting the conversation to anything else. One afternoon, as she stood in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, the doorbell rang. Her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened the door, there stood a man she had never seen before, dressed in a dark suit. He was tall, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to look right through her. Without a word, he handed her a small envelope and turned to leave. The mother's hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper on which was written just one line. "They're watching you." She stared at the words, her breath catching in her throat. Who was this man? Why had he left this cryptic message at her door? And who was they? Her mind raced, but no answers came. As the days stretched on, the feeling of being watched became impossible to ignore. It wasn't just the strange looks from neighbors or the man with the envelope. It was in the air, a constant presence. She felt it when she walked to the store, when she sat in her car, even when she was alone in her house. Eyes were on her, and they were waiting. The girl's behavior continued to spiral. She spoke less and less, and when she did, it was as if she were talking to someone who wasn't there. The mother would ask her what was wrong, but the girl only looked at her, her eyes hollow and distant. One evening, as the sun began to set, the mother decided to take action. She could no longer wait in the dark, hoping the answers would come to her. She had to find out who had taken her daughter, who these strangers were, and why they had come into their lives in the first place. She had to understand what was happening before it was too late. She took her daughter's hand and led her outside, determined to find answers. They walked through the streets, the fading light casting long shadows across the pavement. The air felt heavy, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The closer they got to the edge of town, the more the feeling of unease grew. It was as if something was waiting for them, something that neither of them could see. As they neared the woods that bordered the town, the girl suddenly stopped. She pulled her hand free from her mother's grip, her eyes wide with fear. "No," she whispered, backing away slowly. "We can't go there. It's not safe." The mother tried to pull her back, but the girl was resolute, her face pale with terror. "They're waiting," she said in a voice barely audible. "They're always watching. They won't stop." The mother's heart hammered in her chest. She had to know what the girl meant. She had to find out what was hidden in those woods, what secrets they held. But as she reached out to her daughter, a sudden chill ran through the air, and a low rumble echoed from deep within the trees. Something was coming, something that made the earth tremble beneath their feet. The girl gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she stumbled backward. "It's them," she breathed. "They found us." Panic set in as the mother turned to run, but the girl suddenly collapsed to the ground, clutching her head in pain. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, began to echo from the woods, getting closer with every passing second. The air seemed to thicken, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The mother knelt beside her daughter, trying to help her, but the girl's eyes were wide with fear, her body trembling uncontrollably. She whispered again, her voice shaking. "They're coming for me. They're coming for both of us." The mother's eyes darted around, searching for any sign of what was happening, but all she could hear was the sound of those footsteps, growing louder with each passing moment. The fear in the girl's eyes was contagious, sending waves of dread crashing over the mother's heart. And then, just as the footsteps seemed to be right on top of them, a voice broke the silence, a voice soft and eerie, as though it were coming from everywhere at once. "Do you really think you can escape?" The mother's blood ran cold. She looked around, but there was no one there. The voice seemed to come from the very trees themselves, wrapping around her like a cold, invisible hand. The tension in the air was unbearable, and the realization hit her like a punch to the gut. They were not alone. Not anymore. Her eyes locked with her daughter's, and in that moment, she understood. This wasn't over. It had only just begun. The voice that echoed through the trees sent a shiver up the mother's spine, cold and unfamiliar, as if it had no origin. She held her daughter tightly, trying to comfort her, though she herself felt a gnawing sense of dread that she couldn't shake. The footsteps had stopped, and for a moment, the silence was deafening. The air was thick with tension, the quiet before the storm. The girl trembled in her mother's arms, her eyes wide with terror, yet there was something else in them now, a flicker of recognition, a strange understanding that sent the mother's heart racing even faster. The girl's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she let out a gasp, her entire body tensing, as though she were listening to something only she could hear. The mother's pulse quickened. "What is it? What's happening?" she whispered, almost pleading. For a moment, the girl didn't answer. She simply stared into the trees, her breathing shallow. Then, in a voice barely audible, she spoke. "It's not just them. There's someone else." The mother's stomach dropped. The hair on her neck stood on end. Who could possibly be with them? Who else was involved in this nightmare? The girl's voice trembled, as if she were afraid of saying too much, afraid of what it might reveal. Before she could ask any more questions, the air around them shifted. The wind picked up, whipping the trees and making the shadows seem to dance in unnatural patterns. A cold gust of wind swept through the clearing, and with it, a sudden rustling, like the sound of something or someone moving just out of sight. The mother instinctively pulled her daughter closer, but the girl, now wide-eyed with fear, pushed her away. "No," she cried, her voice rising with urgency. "It's too late. We can't hide from them." The mother looked around frantically, her eyes searching for any sign of what was coming. The trees seemed to lean in toward them, as if watching, waiting. The air felt charged, heavy with an unnatural presence. A low hum began to vibrate beneath their feet, almost like a distant heartbeat, growing louder with each passing second. And then, as if the ground itself were splitting open, the source of the voice emerged. From the shadows stepped a figure, tall and unnervingly still. It was cloaked in darkness, its features hidden by the thick cloak that billowed around it. At first, the mother thought it was just a trick of the light, but as the figure moved closer, the reality hit her like a slap in the face. This was no ordinary person. This was something else, something much more dangerous. "Who are you?" the mother demanded, her voice shaking with fear. The figure did not respond. Instead, it took another step forward, its presence suffocating. The wind around them began to pick up again, but this time it didn't seem natural. It felt controlled, as if someone or something was manipulating the very air. The sound of the hum, which had been building for what seemed like an eternity, reached a deafening pitch. The trees groaned under the weight of the strange force. The girl looked at the figure, her face pale as she whispered, "It's them. They found us. They're not going to let us go." The figure stepped forward again, and with it, the world seemed to shift. The very ground beneath their feet trembled as the air grew colder, and the space around them felt thinner, as though reality itself was beginning to bend. A low, mechanical whirring filled the silence, and then, to the mother's shock, the figure raised its hand, revealing what appeared to be a glowing device. The hum intensified, and suddenly, a strange, pulsating light erupted from the device, cutting through the trees, casting an eerie glow over everything in its path. The light flickered for a moment, then stabilized, illuminating the area with an unsettling, unnatural clarity. In the glow of the light, the mother saw something that made her heart freeze in her chest. The figure, though humanoid, was not human. Its face, hidden beneath the hood, had begun to shimmer, its features distorting and rippling like water. It was not flesh and blood, but something far more sinister, an illusion, a projection, perhaps. It was like looking at a reflection in a shattered mirror, each fragment of the face showing something different, something unsettling. Before she could react, the girl cried out again, this time with a sense of horror that gripped her very soul. "Mom, it's not just them. It's—" But her words were cut off as the figure's hand flicked upward, and a sharp, piercing sound sliced through the air, silencing the girl instantly. The mother felt a sudden chill wash over her, and as she looked back at her daughter, she saw that her face had gone completely blank. Her eyes were wide, but there was no recognition, no emotion. It was as if her soul had been drained away, leaving nothing behind but an empty shell. A cold, mechanical voice then emanated from the figure, its tone flat and emotionless, but somehow more terrifying for its lack of feeling. "The girl is no longer yours. She is part of something greater. You cannot save her. It is already too late." The words hit the mother like a physical blow. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but her voice caught in her throat. The reality of what was happening, what her daughter had become, and what this figure was sinking in all too quickly. This wasn't just some abduction gone wrong. This was something far beyond that. Something bigger than her daughter, and far beyond her understanding. Desperation surged through her. She reached for her daughter, hoping that somehow, in some way, she could bring her back, but the girl stood motionless, her eyes now devoid of all life. The mother's hands trembled as she tried to pull the girl away from the figure, but it was like trying to move a stone. She couldn't budge her. The figure's voice came again, more menacing this time. "You will not interfere. The girl has already made her choice. She has accepted what she is. The transformation is complete." Transformation. What was it talking about? What had happened to her daughter? The questions piled on top of one another, but the more the mother searched for answers, the more she realized she might never find them. All she knew for certain was that her daughter was no longer the girl she had raised. And whatever this dark presence was, it had something to do with it. With a sudden, harsh movement, the figure stepped back, and the glow from the device flickered once more. It turned, its cloak billowing behind it, and began to fade into the darkness of the trees. The hum of its device still echoed in the air, growing fainter, until all that remained was the sound of the wind and the eerie silence of the woods. The mother stood there, frozen in place, as her daughter's lifeless form remained standing before her. Her mind raced with unanswered questions, but one thing was painfully clear. Whatever was happening, it wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The figure vanished into the shadows, and the mother stood there, trembling with fear and confusion. Her heart pounded in her chest, and the world around her seemed to spin as she tried to make sense of everything that had just happened. The girl, her daughter, stood motionless before her, her eyes vacant, distant. The warmth and life that had once radiated from her were gone, replaced by an eerie emptiness. She wasn't just lost anymore. She was changed. But there was still a flicker of something inside the girl, something the mother could almost sense. It was faint, like a tiny spark buried deep beneath the surface. Despite the transformation, despite the chilling words from the figure, the mother refused to believe that her daughter was truly gone. "Please, please, wake up," the mother whispered, reaching out to touch her daughter's face. Her fingers trembled as they brushed against her cold skin. "You're still in there. I know you are." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the girl's lips parted, and she whispered, barely audible, "I'm sorry, Mom. I had no choice." The mother's heart sank. She couldn't comprehend what her daughter meant. Had she been forced into this transformation? Was she somehow trapped by whatever force had taken control of her? The mother had so many questions, but now wasn't the time for them. She needed to act, before it was too late. Without thinking, she grabbed her daughter's hand and tried to pull her away from the spot where they stood. But the girl resisted, her body stiff and unyielding. "Don't," she said quietly. "It's already too late. I can't go with you." The mother's chest tightened. She refused to give up, refusing to believe that her daughter was lost forever. "You're not lost," she cried, gripping the girl's hand tighter. "I'll help you. We can fix this, I swear." But the girl's eyes were vacant again, as though she couldn't hear her mother. And then, in a chilling moment of realization, the mother noticed something she hadn't seen before. The same eerie, otherworldly glow that had surrounded the figure was now beginning to pulse faintly from the girl's body. The transformation wasn't just physical. It was deep, something that touched her very soul. The air grew heavier, the world around them darkening even more. A low growl echoed from the woods behind them. It wasn't human. It wasn't even something earthly. The mother's blood ran cold as she turned, looking into the darkness, trying to make out what was there. Out of the shadows emerged another figure, this one much larger, its outline blurry and indistinct. It was cloaked in shadows, but its presence was suffocating. The hum in the air intensified, and the ground beneath their feet began to shake. The second figure stepped forward, its form taking shape, and as it did, the mother gasped in horror. It was no longer just a humanoid figure. It had transformed into something monstrous, an amalgamation of different creatures, its form shifting and contorting as though it was constantly changing. One moment it had wings, the next it was a mass of writhing tendrils, and then it was something altogether unrecognizable. Its eyes, glowing red, fixed on the mother with an intensity that made her heart stop. "Run," the girl whispered, her voice now hollow, almost robotic. "You have to run. They're going to destroy you." "No," the mother shouted, her voice cracking with desperation. "I won't leave you." But the girl's eyes turned away from her, and she stepped back slowly. "You can't save me. I'm not who I was anymore." The mother's mind raced, the horrifying reality of what was happening settling in her bones. This wasn't just an attack. It was a complete takeover. They had done something to her daughter, something irreversible. She was fighting a battle against something far more powerful than she had ever imagined. Suddenly, the monstrous figure lunged forward, its enormous form crashing through the trees. The air smelled of something foul, and the mother was thrown to the ground, the force of its presence knocking the breath from her lungs. The girl remained still, standing in the center of the clearing, as though she was waiting for something, waiting for the inevitable. The mother scrambled to her feet, fear surging through her veins. She had to act, and she had to act fast. Without thinking, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small object, a pendant, something her daughter had once worn as a child. It was a symbol of their bond, a piece of her daughter's past that still held meaning. She had carried it with her all these years, hoping one day it would remind her of the girl she used to know. Desperation flooded through her as she held the pendant out toward the girl, her voice trembling as she called her name. "Please, sweetheart, come back to me. I love you. You're still my daughter. You always will be." For a long moment, nothing happened. The monster continued to loom over them, its eyes glowing with menace. But then something flickered in the girl's eyes. It was barely noticeable, a slight change, but it was there. "Mom," she whispered, her voice faint, barely audible above the roar of the creature. "I remember." The mother's heart soared. She could see it now, the tiniest spark of her daughter, buried beneath all the darkness. She had found her. She wasn't lost. Not completely. The girl took a step forward, reaching for the pendant with trembling hands. But before she could touch it, the monstrous figure moved. It let out a horrific screech and lashed out with one of its massive arms. The mother barely had time to react as the creature swiped at her, knocking her aside with a force that sent her crashing into the ground. Everything blurred. Pain shot through her body, but through the haze, she heard her daughter scream, a piercing cry that cut through the air. "No, don't hurt her." The creature paused, its attention now fully on the girl. And then something unexpected happened. The girl stepped forward, her face no longer lifeless, no longer empty. There was a fierce determination in her eyes, a fire that hadn't been there before. She raised her hands, and the light from the pendant began to glow brighter than ever before, pulsating with an energy that was almost blinding. The monster recoiled, its body rippling in pain as if the light was burning it. The girl, her expression fierce, held the pendant out in front of her, the glow intensifying. "I'm not what you made me," she said, her voice full of power. The creature writhed, its form shifting violently. And then, with a final, deafening roar, it exploded into darkness, vanishing into the air as if it had never existed. For a long moment, everything was silent. The mother lay on the ground, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Slowly, she looked up to see her daughter standing over her, the pendant still glowing brightly in her hands. Her eyes were clear, no longer filled with the emptiness they had carried before. "Mom," the girl whispered, her voice soft and full of emotion. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know how to stop them." The mother's heart swelled with relief, tears streaming down her face as she reached for her daughter. "You're back. You're really back." But just as she thought the nightmare was finally over, the ground beneath them trembled once again. This time, the shaking wasn't from the creature. The mother's eyes widened in horror as a new, darker shadow appeared in the distance, something much larger than anything they had faced before. And as the figure loomed closer, the final twist was revealed. It wasn't just one enemy they had to face. It was a whole army, an army that had been watching them the entire time. The ground trembled again, but this time it wasn't just a shake, it was a roar. The mother's heart sank as she watched the shadow growing larger, blocking out the light around them. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, and its size alone was enough to make her blood run cold. She could feel the dread rising in her chest, as though the very air around them was thick with malevolence. Her daughter stepped forward, gripping the glowing pendant tightly. The warmth of the light in her hands seemed to push back the darkness, but it wasn't enough. The approaching shadow was too vast, too powerful. The mother knew they weren't prepared for what was coming. "Mom, stay close," the girl said, her voice strong but tinged with fear. "I don't know if I can stop them this time." The mother nodded, taking a deep breath. The girl had come so far, overcome so much. She had faced the dark forces that had taken control of her, fought back, and now was the moment of truth. But the army approaching them was unlike anything they had ever encountered. This was no ordinary foe. It was an entire force, and they were here for one thing: to reclaim the girl. The shadow moved closer, its shape taking form as it revealed itself to be an enormous ship, hovering just above the ground. A series of mechanical creatures, each with glowing eyes and metal limbs, marched forward from its belly. They were tall, intimidating, and their presence alone was enough to send a wave of fear through the air. The girl tightened her grip on the pendant. "They're here to take me back," she whispered, her voice quivering. "They won't stop until they do." The mother's heart clenched at the thought of losing her daughter again. She looked at her, the fierce resolve in her eyes now a beacon of hope. "No," she said, her voice steady. "You're not going back. Not now. We'll fight." Before the girl could respond, the metal creatures moved in, their cold, mechanical eyes fixed on them. The mother's instinct kicked in, and she reached for her daughter, pulling her back, away from the advancing army. The girl shook her head, but this time, there was no hesitation in her eyes. "I can do this," she said. "I can stop them. But I need you to trust me." The mother's gaze softened, the bond between them stronger than ever. "I trust you," she whispered. With a deep breath, the girl stepped forward, her hands raised to the sky. The pendant pulsed with light, brighter than before. The air around them shimmered, and the ground beneath them seemed to hum with energy. For a moment, it felt as if the world itself was holding its breath. Then, with a single command, the girl released the energy she had been holding back. The light erupted in a wave of pure power, cutting through the mechanical creatures and sending them crashing to the ground in sparks and smoke. One by one, the enemies fell, their forms disintegrating as the light engulfed them. The ship, too, shuddered and groaned under the force of the energy, its engine sputtering as it tried to maintain control. But the girl didn't stop. She pushed harder, her energy growing stronger as she called upon the power within her. The air crackled with electricity, and the sky above them flashed with brilliant light. It was a battle, not just against the army, but against the darkness that had tried to consume her. She fought not only for her own freedom, but for the future of everyone she loved. With a final, overwhelming surge of light, the last of the mechanical creatures was obliterated, and the ship exploded in a blinding flash. The mother shielded her eyes from the explosion, her heart pounding in her chest. When the light finally faded, all that remained was silence. The army had been vanquished, but the cost had been high. The girl collapsed to her knees, exhausted and breathless. The pendant, now dimmed, slipped from her grasp, falling to the ground with a soft clink. The mother rushed to her side, pulling her into her arms. "You did it," the mother whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You saved us." The girl smiled weakly, her eyes closing in exhaustion. "We did it," she said softly. "Together." The mother held her close, the weight of everything they had been through settling in. It wasn't over yet. There were still so many unanswered questions, so much that they didn't understand about what had happened. But for now, the danger had passed. For now, they were safe. As the girl rested in her mother's arms, the two of them looked out at the remnants of the battle. The darkness had been pushed back, but the scars of what had happened would never fully fade. The mother knew that this was just the beginning, that the world they had once known was no longer the same. There would be challenges ahead, mysteries to solve, and dangers to face. But they had each other, and that was enough. The girl stirred in her mother's arms, her voice barely a whisper. I remember everything. It's not over, is it?" The mother kissed her forehead gently, her eyes filled with love and determination. "No, it's not over. But we'll face it together, whatever comes next." And as they sat there, in the quiet aftermath of the battle, the first rays of dawn began to break through the clouds. The sun rose over the horizon, casting a warm glow over the land. It was a new day, And with it came hope. A hope that no matter what challenges they faced in the future, they would be ready to face them together. The story wasn't finished, but the bond between mother and daughter was stronger than ever. And in the end, that was all that mattered.